Hello, and welcome to the final part of my American Imperialism lecture series. Today we'll be taking a look at the American imperialism under the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and how he expanded the cause of American imperialism during his presidency. And so, without any further ado, let us begin. So, in a bit of a contrast to Teddy Roosevelt's philosophy of dealing with large corporations, he distrusted power for large corporations, but he was very much open to the idea of more power for the government. And he believed that the United States should hold the center of the world stage. His big philosophy was, of course, speak softly and carry a big stick. Now, in that analogy, the big stick is the American Army and Navy. Where for him, it was really more the Navy than the Army, but it's similarly. He desired the United States to become a major naval power, and as a result, he was kind of the follower of Captain Mahan's naval philosophy. If you remember the book he wrote a couple videos ago discussing how the United States needs a very large navy, and some of his other ideas that he came up with and proposed in his book wind up becoming reality under Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. A little bit of an example of how much Teddy increased the American Navy. Before the Spanish-American War, the United States Navy had 5 battleships and 2 armored cruisers. Now, 5 battleships is a lot. In World War II, at the Battle of Surigao Strait, the American Navy had 6 battleships, and the Japanese came after them with about 1, a few cruisers, and a few destroyers, and they just were absolutely obliterated by these 6 massive vessels. Because a battleship has very, very large caliber guns and has a lot of armor, so they're very difficult to sink with another ship, usually with a battleship. But then after the Spanish-American War in 1909, the American Navy had 25 battleships, nearly 5 times that number, and 10 heavy cruisers. So we're upping our production game and upping our numbers quite a lot. The United States became the second largest naval power behind Great Britain during this time period. So the American Navy become the second largest naval power, and then as time went on, we get into the World War II era, and the third largest wound up being Japan. And then after Japan, believe it or not, it was Italy. So that's something you don't find out every day. Italy had the 4th largest navy in the world during World War II. So the United States, during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, one of the big things that we get involved in is the Russo-Japanese War. So what happened was the Russians had moved to control the Chinese province of Manchuria, which is kind of just north of Korea. That's where Manchuria is. This was a violation of the open door policy, but Teddy Roosevelt couldn't really do anything to stop their aggression. Manchuria at the time was under the sphere of influence of the Japanese Empire, so Manchuria up until the end of World War II would be in charge of under control essentially of Japan as well as Korea. So that was kind of their little portion of China that they controlled, and the Russians decided they wanted to have some of that. So Teddy Roosevelt during this conflict sided with the Japanese, and I suspect this was because the Japanese were very, very much beating the Russians very badly in this war. And the Manchuria, and so what basically happened was he didn't want to see, he sided with the Japanese, but he didn't want to see the Russians expelled from China. And the reason was because he believed that he could play the two sides off of each other and keep them mutually contained in China to ensure Chinese independence. So he's afraid that if Russia is removed from China, which if he had not intervened, they almost certainly would have been, he's afraid that Japan is going to take over China as a whole, and that will negatively influence China's independence because they'll get too powerful. Where he's saying, no, we need to have both of these countries in this region so they will balance each other out. And so Teddy Roosevelt decided to act as an intermediary in an attempt to bring an end to the conflict before the Japanese obliterated the Russians. He had envoys from both sides meet in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and had announced a peace treaty in August of 1905. These actions eventually won Teddy Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize, and the agreement was the Root-Takahara Agreement, in which Japan And basically it said that Japan would annex the Korean Peninsula and pursue its own interests in Manchuria, which meant that Manchuria was basically going to be part of Japan's sphere of influence. Additionally, as a little bit of an add-on to that, Japan would not interfere with American colonies in the Pacific, so they would leave American colonies alone. Looking forward, when I think of World War II, I find this to be kind of ironic in the future, but we're not. That's a little bit outside the sphere of influence of this video. So that was the general peace agreement. However, despite the fact that Teddy did manage to make peace, a lot of Americans were a bit upset at the fact that he was getting involved in these other affairs of countries, because the United States really didn't have any, involvement or reason to be involved in the Russo-Japanese War. So people were saying, well, why are you getting involved in this war that we have nothing to do with and we don't really need to get involved in? So why do you even care, man? We have bigger issues to deal with over here. And they kind of pointed to the idea of the Founding Fathers in the sense of what Teddy Roosevelt was kind of bartering with the independence of the Chinese, and so he's saying it's against the beliefs of the Founding Fathers to barter with the independence of others, saying, well, no, you guys don't get China, they get China. Or you guys don't get to control those other people, they get to control those other people. And they're saying that's not what this country was founded on. We shouldn't be actively negotiating that kind of deal. And they also recalled George Washington's one of his precedents that he set in his speeches at his leaving office was he said that we should not get into entangling alliances, which is with this agreement and trying to foster this deal, which is what we were getting into, was entangling alliances. And George Washington said we shouldn't do that. So Teddy's kind of going against the advice of the first president of the United States, one of our major revered historical figures, George Washington. And then additionally, in terms of the in Asia, we have the open door. And as far as Roosevelt was concerned with the open door, he was a realist. He was in favor of the open door as long as we could maintain it through diplomacy. In Manchuria, Teddy had seen that the Japanese were willing to risk war to get their way. So he believed, and as a result of this, he kind of came up with the belief, he thought that the United States should only take a firm stand on an international issue if it's in our best interests. If we're not really going to gain anything from a conflict that might be entered or began with us taking a stand on it, then we shouldn't really be getting involved in it. So if we don't have a reason to be getting involved in an issue, then we shouldn't really be getting involved and we should leave it alone. And then, again, TR, having seen how willing the Japanese were to go to war, he decided to send a message. And so he wants to maintain peaceful terms with the world, but he doesn't really want to go. He doesn't want the United States to be shown as weak. Again, big stick diplomacy. So this is where we have the voyage of the Great White Fleet, which is one of the most aesthetically pleasing things that's happened during this period, I suppose you could say, where in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt sent a fleet of 16 American battleships around the world to prove or to show off the power of the United States Navy to other nations, mainly Japan. So he has all these battleships painted white, as you see in the photographs that I've gotten here in color. Well, the one photograph is colorized of the painting, and the white was meant to show that we're not aggressive, because white is like the color representing purity, peace, innocence. So we've painted these warships white to show that we're not aggressive in any way, and we're not trying to intimidate, but at the same time, it is kind of intimidating because you have these big warships showing up at your door in a very bright color that draws attention. And they sent it around the world to different places to just demonstrate the fact that we're here, we have these very large ships, and again, embracing that whole theme of during this time period, America is emerging on the world stage as a world power, and is here to say that we are not to be trifled with, be careful. We're not being aggressive to anybody, but we're just sailing around saying, hey, this is what we got. If you want to mess with us, this is what we have. Just keep in mind, And so that was and also showing off this kind of new, modern Navy, because, again, it's only been 50 years after the Civil War. There's a very radical technology shift has happened with these large guns and ships with no longer having sails. If you notice the departure from the Civil War era warships, there's not even who had steam powered boilers, but they had sails as well as a backup. These ships don't have any sails, so they don't need that backup as the steam technology has advanced enough that a backup of sail is no longer needed. They have room to put larger guns, and there's less. It's more modern and advanced than the older sailing type ships, you could say. And then now we come to the other large achievement of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency in terms of foreign policy was the Panama Canal. And he would be much more aggressive in his foreign policy in the Caribbean than he would be with the major powers in the Pacific. So he does things in the Caribbean that he would never have done in the Pacific with the other world powers in China and other places, just because it would have risked war with a great large country. So his belief was that the United States needed to dominate this region of the Caribbean and South America. He was a very strong proponent of the canal in Panama, and he thought that as a world power, the United States needs to move its navy from one ocean to the other, and a canal through Panama would be the easiest way to do this. Additionally, the ease of commerce between the two oceans is an added bonus, because if you want to sail from Los Angeles to New York City, for example, without the Panama Canal, you have to go all the way down South America, around the tip of South America, and then all the way up that east coast to New York City. Whereas with the Panama Canal, you need to just go right through Panama, and you go through the Gulf of Mexico up to past Florida, and then you're in New York. It's literally cutting the journey in half. It's kind of a way you could think of looking at it as we finally created the, quote, Northwest Passage that all of the colonial settlers in the 1700s and 1600s, when they were coming across to the New World and were looking for, we finally created it ourselves rather than trying to hope that we could find one and accidentally stumbling across the Great Lakes. There was one issue, though. The Panamanian Isthmus, where we were planning on building this canal, was controlled by Colombia. Teddy Roosevelt sent a representative to Colombia to negotiate, and they asked for $30 million from the United States and the French corporation that had previously attempted to dig a canal, but was stopped due to the workers falling ill with yellow fever. And they also still owned the land the canal was being built on. So they asked for $30 million from kind of a combination of the both. And back then, that was a lot of money. And so as a result, an American-backed revolution wound up breaking out in Panama shortly after this deal was offered. Kind of funny how they offer this deal that's saying, oh, give us a whole lot of money and we'll give you Panama. And then all of a sudden, oh, look, a revolution's broken out. They've broken off from your country. How sad. The United States actually sent Marines to keep the Colombian troops from entering the new nation of Panama, which then very, very quickly signed a treaty leasing the land that the canal was to be built on to the United States. And that, kids, is how you build a canal. Make a new country and then have them sell it to you. That's how it works. So very, very underhanded and brutish, just kind of going in there, grabbing the land and running away, you could basically say. Additionally, work began on the canal in 1904 after we take over Panama, but was stopped by an outbreak of yellow fever. That was the big issue, was that disease. And so to continue work, we had to cure yellow fever. So Dr. William Gorgas was assigned to work with Dr. Walter Reed, two famous medical gentlemen. Reed had been spending time in Cuba, also looking at yellow fever. Additionally, then they had to move to Canada to prevent the spread of the disease. Did I say Canada? I meant to say Panama. Listen to me. They led expeditions to destroy the breeding grounds for mosquitoes that carry these diseases. And this eventually led to cures for yellow fever across the world and paved the way for the canal. So basically, in the process of building the Panama Canal, we wound up curing yellow fever. So that's not a little bit of an added benefit, I guess you could say. And then within 8 years of the resumption of work in 1906, ships were passing through the canal, as you see depicted in the bottom left picture. And Teddy Roosevelt, in his usual way, was very boisterous about the fact that he had taken the canal by force. As he said, I took the canal zone and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes on, the canal does also. So kind of he was not showing any regret there in that he's saying that, I just took it and I went in and I did the thing that needed to be done and let the politicians argue. He's like, I'm not going to let this sit in committee and have them haggle over prices. I'm just going to take it because I can, because I've got that big stick that I'm going to hit the Colombians with if they try to jip me out of the money that I deserve. And later on, Woodrow Wilson, during his presidency, negotiated a deal to pay $25 million to Colombia for the loss of Panama with, quote, sincere regret attached to that. And then Teddy and his supporters, because he's still alive, were lobbying aggressively for the removal of that clause saying that we had expressed sincere regret, because he's like, no, we don't express regret. That was the good thing to do. He was like calling it an insult to his presidency. And so eventually, with enough shouting and angry stomping of feet and fuss and bother, eventually that clause was removed. So Colombia got that $25 million, but the United States as a government officially did not recognize sincere regret to Colombia saying we're sorry. So we're like, here's the money, we're not sorry. That was essentially what the message was being sent to the Colombians. And on a larger scheme, we see the addition of what's known as the Roosevelt's corollary. And what that was, well, I'm going to explain it. So smaller South American countries begin to bankrupt their governments by taking out loans from Europe to start to build up their empires, or not empires, but to build up their nations to become more westernized, you could say. And so a big example was the Dominican Republic. And what happened was European creditors threatened to use force to collect the money that was owed to them because the Dominicans could not pay it back. And so Roosevelt, in response to this, announces his corollary. And he says that in the case of chronic wrongdoing or impotence of a Latin American state, the United States would intervene. And so, with the consent of the government of the Dominican Republic, the U.S. took over the affairs of their country. And basically, they assisted the Dominicans in the repayment of their debts. And so they kind of took over, they sent in their own bankers, reorganized the finance. So instead of European creditors coming in, it was the Americans who came in to renegotiate the finance and eventually pay the Europeans their money. And the larger significance of this corollary is that it was a severe step up from the Monroe Doctrine. It was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. It was kind of like here's the Monroe Doctrine, and then Teddy Roosevelt wrote a P.S. and stuck that on the bottom of it as well. And he said it was the job of the U.S. to police the entire continent of South America, not just to keep the Europeans out. So he's expanded what the Monroe Doctrine means. And this sets the ground for U.S. interventions in several Latin American countries in the future, even up till like now. Case in point, you could argue that the Iran-Contra scandal, the Nicaraguan selling of weapons, that could count as an intervention under the Roosevelt corollary. Additionally, the intervention in, Grenada was another example of a intervention. Many, many others that I could endlessly name, dictators that have been propped up by the United States in Latin American countries because they were anti-communism. But I'm, again, getting outside the scope of this video. But when you hear about those events later on in American history, this is kind of where that precedent for intervening starts, is with Teddy Roosevelt and his corollary. And so kind of the last thing I want to mention here is Taft. And Taft's presidency is kind of, he changes a little bit but keeps it, he changes the philosophy a little bit but not as much. So he introduced this idea called dollar diplomacy. And what dollar diplomacy is, that we are going to use the ambassadorship and the good name of the United States, and if necessary, the armed forces, to promote business. So he and his Secretary of State, Philander C. Knox, encourage Americans to invest abroad and to build American influence. So he pushes bankers to invest in China and places like that. And due to this investing by Americans, the Japanese and the Russians see this, and they kind of get worried, and so they then try to expand their sphere of influence in China for the fear of losing out to the United States. He also declared that the United States would protect American investments abroad. And for example, when civil war broke out in Nicaragua in 1912, Taft sent the Marines in to protect American business interests. These interventions would wind up leading Latin Americans actually to question whether or not the Americans were even remembering their own Declaration of Independence, because, here we are saying, you're independent of foreign rule. Well, now here you are, a foreign country trying to rule over us. So what's the deal? That kind of philosophy. So with Taft, he's putting away the big stick. He's like, look, I'm putting away the big stick. We're going to increase our influence by investing and not with military intervention. However, he's like, if we need to, we're going to use military intervention. So what he's essentially saying is he's like, I'm putting Teddy Roosevelt's big stick on a shelf. I'm putting it on the shelf, but I'm not putting it into a safe or into a glass case to be displayed and looked at later. It's on the shelf because it's not being used right now, but if I need it in the future, I'm going to take it off that shelf and use it. So he's not throwing out the big stick, but he's just kind of putting it off to the side and saying, I might need this later, let's keep it ready, but where it's not, I'm not going to hold it in my hand or put it in my pocket. I'm going to just kind of put it on the side and use it if I need to. And that's kind of what's being held over people's heads, is kind of that, he's not out. He might pull it out, but he's putting it away for now, and he's going to let the private business go in there and increase our prestige or our influence abroad in a more indirect way where the government is not directly involved. And that's really all I have to say for today's video. Thank you for listening and attending. Our next video series, if we begin one, we'll be looking at World War I. And we didn't really talk about Wilson's foreign policy in this series because his foreign policy more ties into World War I, which is why it's not really looked at now, because his foreign policy perspective is defined by the First World War, so that would be more appropriate to look at in a First World War unit. So that being said, this is the end of this video. I do hope you enjoyed. I will see you in the next video.